Thank you all for coming, and a special thanks to JF Books for organizing this. And I want to do four things in this. I want to put Macau in its historical context. I want to talk about the unique status of the British China Consular Service. I want to talk about Macau in the Second World War, refugees, espionage, escapes, and finally the role played by the very hapless and somewhat tragic John Reeves, who was the British consul in Macau during the war. Here is Macau, about 40 miles west of Hong Kong on the Pearl River Delta. And the only other thing, this is what was then Chongqing, the capital of nationalist China during the war, unoccupied China. And it's about 800 miles between Hong Kong and Chongqing. What on earth is Macau doing there? You've got to really go back to the end of the Middle Ages, and there's Portugal. And if you're as ignorant about geography as I was, you think of Portugal as the Iberian Peninsula, it's a Mediterranean country. It's not. It faces the Atlantic. It had no access to the Mediterranean. So all the trade from Asia and the Middle East was coming through Damascus, Aleppo, Constantinople, to the great Italian ports of Venice and Genoa. And Portugal was cut off. This man, known as Henry the Navigator, Prince Henry the Navigator, decided that they were going to get to Asia in a very different way. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to sail around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, the first Europeans to reach India, to reach the rest of Asia, the first Europeans to circumnavigate the world. And so by the 1560s, the Portuguese had tiny little towns all throughout Africa, the Middle East, Goa, Malacca, Madras, Timor, and Macau. So you get to 1557 when a motley band of merchants, priests, sailors, and soldiers got to the Pearl River Delta, to the Amacá Bay, and founded a small Portuguese town with town squares, cathedrals, churches, castles, fountains. In 1557, 2 years before Elizabeth I was on the throne, Michelangelo was carving marble in Florence 60 years before the Pilgrim Fathers arrived in the US. And Macau was the most important European city in that part of Asia for 300 years. It monopolized the trade between the West, China, and Japan. And if you've seen Shogun, you would have seen the references to the Great Black Ship from Macau. And that lasted until 1617, when the Shoguns expelled the West. And then Macau was China's gateway to the West. The Jesuits came to Macau, founded the first Western university, the first printing press, and they brought Greek, Latin, philosophy, music, painting, astronomy, higher mathematics, and even a new calendar to Peking. Macau was the West's gateway into China and its trade until 1842. The merchants went and built large warehouses 50 miles north of Macau in Canton. The goods were loaded onto junks, sailed down the Pearl River to Macau, where the ships from all over the world were there to take them on. From October to May, the merchants were made to move out of Canton. They moved to Macau. This house is still standing. It's now a museum. It was the residence of the head of the British East India Company. Then what happened? Why did Macau fade from the world scene? Two major factors. The British were selling opium. The Chinese made the decision it was harmful to their people. They prohibited its importation. And the British, in a very kind of Donald Trump move, solved the trade dispute by declaring war on China. The Chinese lost, and as a result of that, as opposed to one town, Macau, over dozens and dozens of towns were opened up to foreign trade. And of course, the other factor, the British got a lease on a little island near Macau and founded the town of Hong Kong, which became very quickly the largest and most prosperous city in that part of the world. In 1843, a unique branch of the British Foreign Office was established, the China Consular Service. Now, the British had a presence in 28 of those towns, and in each one was a British consul. And it was a very prestigious job because the British settlement in those towns was a little piece of England where Chinese law didn't apply. Chinese were often not even permitted to enter. There was British law applied. The British consul ran a police force. He acted as a judge. He could sentence people to jail. These are two British China consuls from 1910. You would think this was a very prestigious job. It was actually exactly the opposite. Firstly, the consuls had a very low status within the British diplomatic service. Secondly, the China consuls had a reputation, and I'll read from a 1927 report of the Foreign Office, characterized by suicide, insanity, theft, drunkenness, association with loose women, the taking of Chinese women as mistresses, often open and notoriously, lonely and remote posts in China tend to produce, even in strong characters, a degree of degeneration. Then, in 1936, Macau had a brief moment in the sun. Pan American arrived. This was the equivalent then of the moonshot. It was a pivotal moment in human history where Juan Trippe, the founder of Pan Am, figured out how to fly from San Francisco to China, landing in Macau. 9-day trip, you'd land in a little island, you get off the plane, you were in a hotel, the plane would take off again the next morning. For those of you who have been in the back row in economy on a flight to Asia, this will just make you cry. The most luxurious aircraft ever built. The wingspan 3/4 of the size of a 747. Dining rooms, lounges, bunks, and he landed in Macau. Why Macau and not Hong Kong? Juan Trippe, the founder of Pan Am, applied to land in Hong Kong. The British denied it because they wanted their own air service to come in. That's the Pan Am radio station. Trouble is, this is the only aircraft they had, a little 9-seater de Havilland. After 3 weeks of Juan Trippe landing in Macau, the Hong Kong government gave up. They gave him landing rights, but every single flight stopped in Macau on its way to Hong Kong. Then, 1941, December the 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, December the 8th on the other side of the daylight, attack of Hong Kong, the fall of Singapore, and within 5 months, the Japanese had occupied almost all of Southeast Asia, except they got to the gates of Macau and they stopped. Why was Macau left alone? Portugal was neutral. Oh, by the way, that gate is still there, now dwarfed by the Chinese immigration building behind it. This is all Macau had to defend itself, a little gunboat and 6 little British Osprey biplanes. It could have been taken in 20 minutes, but it managed to stay neutral the whole time. Then John Reeves, 6 months earlier, had arrived as the British consul in Macau. He had joined the China Consular Service. He had 2 insignificant posts before that. He was sent to Macau, quote, for a rest cure. Macau was of no conceivable interest to anyone at the time. The only reason he was sent there was the Japanese had sent a consul there. He came there a month or so later. This was consulate in Macau. He lived in a beautiful Art Deco building up on the hills. It's still there. So you look at Macau at the beginning of the war. Its economy was based on gambling, licensing of prostitution, and the sale of opium. It had 3 manufacturing industries: matches, fireworks, and incense. There were 150,000 people in 1935. That had doubled in 1940 to 300,000 as Chinese refugees flooded into Macau, fleeing the fighting in the north. But it was under constant threat, either starvation or Japanese takeover. It had no farmland. All the fuel had to be imported. And if there was a flood, if there was drought, if there was famine up north, Macau was in deep trouble. But it managed to survive. And overlaying this was the constant threat of Japanese invasion, all times. The Japanese military police moved a unit into Macau. Japanese troops on leave would come and drink in the bars and go to the brothels. This is a 1949 map, but that's essentially what it must have looked like all throughout the war. A tiny town. You can see it in a good afternoon. At one stage, the situation was so dire, the Governor Teixeira arranged for the statue of Our Lady of Fatima, which is the Portuguese Catholic icon, to be paraded through the streets. and placed in the cathedral, and you can still see it. The Portuguese up behind that reads, in translation, Queen of the World, Mother of Portugal, protect Macau. It actually worked. How did Macau survive? This man, P.J. Lobo, a Timorese orphan, took charge of the Macau Economic Services. He set up a joint purchasing agency to get the food and fuel Macau needed. He gave a third of the stock to the Macau government, a third to wealthy Macanese, and a third to the Japanese army. Smart move. The other thing that happened was this bank, which is still there, a little local bank, the Banco Nacional Ultramarino, acted as Macau's central bank, juggling 9 or 10 currencies, keeping silver in reserve, and essentially keeping the economy afloat. Even in the middle of the war, it printed its own currency. Now, what was life like in Macau? If you were wealthy or middle class, it was astoundingly normal. And I found some of these privately printed books about growing up in Macau during the war. Mary Haley Bell. She was the daughter of the British collector of Chinese customs in Macau. There's her sisters and brother. Just as a footnote, after the war, she went to the UK. She married an actor named John Mills. Their daughter was Haley Mills. There were movie theaters, there was a hockey club, the Macau Electric Company had a clubhouse and an orchestra. Reeves talks about eating roast pigeon in restaurants. The roof of the Central Hotel had an orchestra, shade, a jukebox. You read about concerts, fundraisers, theatricals, prize givings, dinners in shady back gardens under royal palms. It was as though the rest of the world did not exist. Now, there were 5 English language newspapers published. Only a few copies survive, and they're in the National Library of Australia in Canberra. And I just looked at some of the advertisements in there. Look, there are first-run movies. You want Australian butter, European and American medicine? Go to the Hotel Riviera, dance to Canaro's orchestra. The ice plant continued, ice cream. Even this odd little ad, I don't know where it came from, but you could buy American toilet paper. And the British consul sent Christmas cards out. If you were poor and destitute, of which almost 100% were the Chinese refugees, life was grim. Refugees flooded over the border. Interestingly, the government made no attempt to stop it. It was open. If you could get there, you could stay in Macau. The Chinese benevolent societies, the Catholic Church did the best that they could, but thousands died every month from starvation, from dysentery, from malaria, from exposure. There were mass burials in pits. Portuguese would not eat in Chinese restaurants. They were afraid of cannibalism. The troops, the Mozambique soldiers in the garrison, every night would take trucks and go and pick up the corpses. By the end of the war, though, the population was 600,000, crammed into that tiny little place. Now, what happened to the Portuguese and British refugees? This was the real hero. Gabriel Teixeira, who was the governor. He kept the borders open. If you were Portuguese, and anyone with any claim to a drop of Portuguese blood could be considered Portuguese, you got an allowance and you were found housing. This was the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux. I gave visas to hundreds of Jewish refugees at the time. Barracks built for the Portuguese refugees. This is a beautiful theater, now lovingly restored. 200 refugees were jammed into this theater. The Bella Vista Hotel had 30 rooms, 300 refugees in there. The British refugees, Reeves ended up taking care of over 9,000 British refugees, English and British subjects from the Empire. He set up medical services. He arranged a pharmacy. He borrowed money from a local merchant and then wired into the Banco Nacional Ultramarino. He got 1.7 million pounds. It just showed up in his account. Google tells me that's about 100 million US dollars in 2025. And he was out by 6 pennies at the end of it. These were dozens of intelligence agencies in Macau. I'm not quite sure what they were all doing there because there wasn't much to discover. By the end of the war, the Japanese were trying to find out where the Allies were going to land. But there were the Japanese, the nationalist Chinese, the Portuguese, the British Army A Group, the Manchurians, the bandits, the triads, Reeves. The Americans had 2 OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, and SACO, Naval Intelligence, and the British had 2. This man, Peter Fleming, ran British military intelligence, 2 operations into Macau. You might recognize his brother, Ian Fleming. who was running British naval intelligence in Portugal. Ian Fleming came to Macau after the war and based the character of Goldfinger on P.J. Lobo, the guy we just saw. The OSS had at least one operation. There's a recording on the website of the Imperial War Museum of some wackadoodle scheme feeding false information to the Japanese. The British had this group of soldiers that ran essentially an escape line out of Macau, medical aid, and spy operations, run by an eccentric Australian who was a professor of physiology before the war at the University of Hong Kong. This picture is the officer's mask. He put this up because if you look at the photographer, the famous society photographer Cecil Beaton, and what he was doing in the middle of China taking these pictures. Some of the documents they sent back, Kai Tak Airport. If you've ever flown into Hong Kong before 1997, you would have flown into that. Japanese gun installation on Cowlitz Island. So then the escapes out of Macau. Remember I showed you Chongqing? If you could get out of Macau and get to Chongqing, you could be flown to India, and then from India you could get to England or the United States. This is like walking from here to Chicago, through bandit-occupied, river-occupied, nationalist-occupied. Reeves arranged for this to happen, working with the British Army, A Group, giving money to the refugees, bribing everybody that needed to be bribed. So first you had to get out of Hong Kong, and you got into the new territories of Hong Kong. Those of you who know Hong Kong well know the new territories. In the war, it was really remote. There were no roads, it was largely hawkers, it was indistinguishable. And these were the people who got people out of Hong Kong, the East River guerrillas. They were communists, but that didn't mind at the time. And then you got to free China, then you got to Macau, and then once you got out of Macau, you ended up in these little swamps where the Japanese patrol boats couldn't, and then you begin the long walk. There's a document from Colonel Ride about some of the people who escaped. I read dozens of accounts of them, and no one story is the same, but this is what is in common about them. Remember that the Japanese lines didn't exist. Japanese had 1 million troops in China. They were largely in the cities or on the front. Not one of these escapees came across a Japanese soldier. No one was in real danger. There were bandits, there were guerrillas, there were communists. All they seemed to want was a little money. Some food was available. But don't underestimate how brutal the trip was. Hundreds of miles of walking, bicycles, sampans, with just a plank over the stern for a toilet before you reach free China. But two things, occasionally they would have a wonderful meal in the village. And these lyrical descriptions of rice and rice wine and mushrooms and lychees and peanut oil frying and green garlic, I'm getting hungry, steamed buns. And then as you came into Lower Sichuan, into Chongqing, you were staggered by the beauty of the landscape. And you all know this, the lakes and the willow trees and the mists and the green-tiled farmhouses, groves of emerald bamboo, and then the sudden arrival in free China. This woman, Phyllis Harrop, with a false Irish passport and false German nationality, escaped to Macau, and then she got the steamer from Macau to Fort Bayard, which was then a French settlement. And she was carried by sedan chair for 6 days until she hit a rail line, able to be taken to the British Embassy in Chongqing. This woman, Marjorie Fletcher, a husband, a 12-year-old boy, 60 people in their party, 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, grandparents, 16 Filipino entertainers escaping. This has never been published. I found an account of her escape in the Imperial War Museum utterly astounding. It was part comic and part tragic. As they slip into rivers, they stumble over things, they lose their luggage, they find it again. But eventually they're in an American missionary leper colony, and a man from the British Embassy appears and puts them in a boat and takes them to the train. And they were then taken to Chongqing and flown home. The real irony is the only time Macau was attacked was by the U.S. Navy. And in January the 16th, a U.S. Naval task force split off from Halsey's 3rd Fleet in an operation called Operation Gratitude, targeted Japanese installations around the Pearl River in Hong Kong and Satao, other places. But it was commanded by this man, whose grandson went on to be a senator from Arizona and run against Obama for president. This is Admiral John S. McCain. And you can see on the battle plans, they were told little information is available about Macau. Macau is clearly on the target list. They bombed it once in the morning, came back in the afternoon. The British consul and the Portuguese governor went down there. They were almost killed. 10 days later, they have a court of inquiry, and it just seems total confusion. 1953, we ended up writing a check for $20 million to the Portuguese. Reeves was hated by the Foreign Office. Why? He seemed to have done such a great job. Firstly, part of it was the Foreign Office fault, simply because they despised the consular service. Then the Reeves seemed to go out of his way to get up the nose of people, to put it delicately. He was indiscreet. He was known for discussing confidential matters loudly. He insisted on writing Hong Kong as one word. Hong Kong was originally one word, at least when translated into English. 1929, the Foreign Office said, no, it's going to be two words. Reeves kept the one word, and this just bugged people. He communicated with the OSS. This is a somewhat testy thing where they're trying to get him a code to replace the one that he himself compromised. And then he put together a committee in Macau as to what post-war Hong Kong would look like. I found this document in the National Library. He's put himself as the head of Hong Kong. This drove the Foreign Office completely out of their trade. And at one stage, they were looking to see if they could get an aircraft into Hong Kong to get him out of there. The war ended. His wife and daughter left him immediately. He never saw them again. He was estranged from them for much of the war. He presided over the World Peace Thanksgiving service. The other factoid about this, the Anglican minister at the time was the first woman ever to be ordained in the Anglican Church, 30 years before the next one, the Reverend Florence Lynn. He was sent to Italy, the worst part of Italy. He was given all the outlying islands, poverty-stricken, ruined by the war. And then they sent him to Surabaya. And Surabaya is the capital of what is now Java province in Indonesia. In November, the Indonesians rose up, tried to fight for their independence. The Dutch didn't have any troops there. The British sent in troops to put down the Indonesian rebellion. November the 10th is still known in Indonesia as Heroes' Day. You get there 2 years after this massacre, you're the British representative. It's an impossible job. He resigned, he moved to South Africa, became a sportscaster, turned into a complete eccentric. He grew his hair down to his shoulders. He dressed in Chinese robes in his house, surrounded by Chinese antiques. He grew his little fingernail out like he had seen the mandarins in Peking at the time. He smoked cigarettes with a long ivory cigarette holder. He wore a pair of slippers said to be worn by the last Dowager Empress, sold to him by a former palace eunuch when he was a student interpreter in Peking. He had his own pair of ivory chopsticks. I just think of Dutch South Africa at the time, hardly the most tolerant place you could imagine. He died in 1977 without seeing his family, without seeing England, without seeing Macau ever again. He was a lonely, tragic man who did the best he could under the circumstances. As he said, he had the only Allied flag flying within thousands of miles. He, a good man, who tried to do his duty, but was unrecognized. He left a manuscript after the war. It was published about 20 years ago by the Royal Asiatic Society, called The Lone Flag. It's really hard going. Just before I end, people ask me what Macau is like now. There are ugly glass buildings. The big Las Vegas casinos, there's the MGM and the Sands are all there. But there are parts of Macau still that you turn a corner and you'd swear you're in Lisbon. This is St. Lawrence's Church, beautifully restored. That's St. Dominic's in the main square. That is what was the governor's mansion. It's now the residence of the administrator of Hong Kong. This kind of pink confection. That's a government building. That is a former residence of one of the Portuguese administrators of Macau. It's now a beautiful museum. It's just a street scene. It's a lovely place, and the food is fantastic. You marry Portuguese cuisine with Cantonese cuisine, and you spice it up with hot peppers and other things, the nutmegs and everything that have come around the world. As I said, you can see it all in a slow day, and you end with a wonderful meal. And that's it. I'm happy to take any questions.
Just a small question about some of the Allied citizens and others who escaped and ended up in Chongqing, as you mentioned. Where were they coming from? Like Mrs. Fletcher, were they coming from Shanghai or Manchuria?
Yeah.
What was their journey?
Some of them were Macau residents. Mrs. Fletcher was the wife of the chief accountant of the Macau Electric Company, which was British owned. The managers of Pan Am had just been stranded there by the war. What was fascinating is I found in the Pan Am archives not only an account of their escape, their expense account for the escape. And it's, so many patakas bribed so-and-so, paid off this bandit to take us there. Others escaped out of the Shamshipur prison camp, like Colonel Ryan, and was smuggled out of Hong Kong through the New Territories. Some of them were just longtime residents of Macau who just wanted to get out. Some had come down from Shanghai, had fled Shanghai.
How did you get to writing a book about nobody consulate from World War II Macau?
Well, we lived in Hong Kong for 5 years. And one of the things we love to do was, there's a high-speed ferry. There are 3 high-speed ferry companies that leave every 20 minutes, or at least used to Macau. It takes you 55 minutes across. And to go across there, spend a day or even stay a night. And it was just fascinating to walk around. And then I'm sufficiently old that my father was in the Pacific in the war. And I grew up with stories of the fall of Hong Kong and the fall of Singapore. And then someone mentioned that Macau was not occupied. It was this Asian Casablanca, this island of neutrality. And I thought, I'd love to write about that. And astoundingly, hundreds of thousands of books written about the Second World War. No one, apart from a couple of academic publications, which really are struggle to get through, had written about this. So, why not?
What was the Japanese presence like in Macau?
The Japanese had a very strong presence in Macau. Ostensibly, it was neutral the whole war. Ostensibly, it was ruled. But, as I said, there was a Japanese military police unit. Bai Tai was there, and they were working with the triads to try and eliminate the nationalists. Japanese troops on leave would come down, hang out in the bars, hang out in the brothels. It would have taken 20 minutes to take over Macau. The governor was constantly balancing between appeasing them and trying to preserve Macau, and did a great job. They violated Macau's neutrality at least once, and they sent a bandit group to seize a British ferry boat, the Cyad, and they just sailed it out there. There was a formal protest lodged. The Japanese were unwilling to go too far because they had a huge embassy in Lisbon, 125 diplomats there, spies and everything. They didn't want to risk losing that. I think the Germans also leaned on the Japanese not to invade. Macau was an important source of a word I'd never heard before, wolfram, which turns out to be tungsten, that the Portuguese were selling to the Germans at the time. It was on a knife edge for 5 years of the war.
So just wondering why people didn't pay attention to Macau before you...
Reeves did write a manuscript, handwritten. The British Foreign Office continued to oppress him. They denied him permission to publish it. It was found in his possessions after the war, and then the Royal Asiatic Society published an edition of it. It's a little hard reading, it's a little boring. It's a civil servant talking about problems of documentation and things like that. It's very much a first draft. Then the University of Hong Kong Press, just before COVID, published a book called Wartime Macau, which is a collection of essays by historians. And again, it's an academic book. And after I written my book, somebody has written the definitive history of Macau in the Second World War. But again, it's very much an academic book. Long chapters about exploring the different definitions of neutrality. The word liminality keeps popping up in there, which kind of puts me to sleep. But no one's written a book for a general audience. I was happy for that.
For your understanding of Macau and also understanding of this part of history, how would you explain this difference between Macau and Hong Kong?
There's some really interesting differences between Macau and Hong Kong. On the negative side, since modern Hong Kong is essentially shaped by being administered by a dictatorship. You weren't dealing with some sort of democratic bubbling up. But the really stark contrast, which impressed me, was a totally different attitude towards race in Macau under the Portuguese but compared to the British in Hong Kong. Right from the start, the Portuguese were not looking for colonies. They were looking for trading posts, small cities. And so they were strung out along the African coast, through the Middle East, and Oman, on the edge of the Red Sea, through Goa, through Madras, through Gaul and what is now Sri Lanka, down to Timor. And the Portuguese sent merchants there, they sent soldiers there, but no Portuguese woman followed. And the men were expected to marry locally and make nice Christian babies. So if you had a drop of Portuguese blood in you, you were Portuguese. And you go to Macau even now, and you see people that look Chinese to you, but you see Herrera, Gonzalez. The Macanese who got to Hong Kong were discriminated against because, quote, they were of mixed race. And they were clerks for all of the banks. And as you see in the books, they were clerks for the British Consular Service, but they could never rise. You've got one Macanese, and he said, one drop of Portuguese blood, Portuguese in Macau, one drop of Chinese blood, and I am Chinese in Hong Kong. That was the big contrast to me between the two cities. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you all for coming. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.